Hello, everyone. By now, you probably know who I am, but just in case you don't, in case perhaps you are surfing YouTube and you come across this video called Sonny's Blues and you're wondering who this white-haired guy is, I'm Professor Ralph Stevens, and I teach a course in critical writing at Coppin State University in Baltimore. So, I want to say a few words about reading Sonny. Oh, no. I want to say a few words about interpreting Sonny's blues. Remember that distinction? The distinction between reading and interpretation? Reading simply means looking at the surface of a text, decoding the words, finding out simply what is there. Reading is a matter of finding the factual details. All right? These details are not open to interpretation in themselves. They are not open to opinion. They simply are there. And before you can accurately, or before you can intelligently, I should say, interpret a work of literature, you need to get a grasp of those details. What do we actually see in the words? What do we see on the page? That's the important thing. All right? Interpretation, then, is a matter of going below the surface and finding out the meaning. So in the case of Sonny's Blues, surface details. We know that Sonny's Blues is a story. It's being told by somebody in the first person, somebody who is saying, I did this, I saw that, I said this, all right, and so on. I experienced that. We know that this person is an algebra teacher, somewhere in New York City, somewhere probably in Harlem, maybe in the Bronx. We're not quite sure. We know that he and his family did live in Harlem when he was a boy. We know that he has a brother named Sonny. We know that Sonny is a heroin addict, or perhaps more accurately, we could say that Sonny is a recovering heroin addict. In the present of the story, we know that Sonny has been in recovery, and he's living with his brother and his brother's wife, Isabel, and so on. These are all surface details. They are simply the facts of the story. They're not open to question. The important thing is that you grasp all of these details. You see them. You see what is on the surface of the text. For example, we know that the narrator had a little girl, a 2-year-old daughter named Gracie, who died of polio. We know that this caused a lot of suffering in the family. We see suffering referred to throughout the story. That word, suffering, is used a lot in the story. All right, all of those things are surface details. Now, if we want to say, okay, well, why all of this reference to suffering? Why do we bring in the death of this little girl, such a painful incident? Why do we bring in the story of the death of Sonny's, would have been Sonny's and his brother's uncle? That is his father's brother, who died at a very young age when he was run over, running down a hill, and ran across a road and was run over, was hit by a car full of white guys. Again, that's just a surface detail, right? We need to get that detail. But why all of this emphasis on painful events that cause suffering in the family? Once you start to answer that question, you are interpreting the story, right? Okay, so keep that distinction in mind. So what we're really going to do here, is we're going to talk about interpreting Sonny's Blues. Oh, wrong book. You probably figured I was going to bring that book up again, right? Because I've done that before. We're going to use a different book today. We're going to use this book. A big book, a very heavy book. Heavy both literally, right? Because it's big, thousands of pages, okay? And heavy also because of the impact that it has had, not just on culture in general, but also on literature. Now, remember that Foster has, early on in his book, he's got 2 chapters. One is a chapter about Shakespeare, okay? And let me look that up. What's the title of that chapter about Shakespeare? It's all about, no, it's not all about, all right? Right. Okay. He says, I need to get my glasses, folks. All right. It's from Shakespeare, chapter 6. When in doubt, it's from Shakespeare. Aha. Okay. And then chapter 7, or the Bible. And in that chapter on the Bible, Foster talks about how to use the Bible to interpret literature. Okay, now before we go any farther, we need to make one thing very clear. You do not need Shakespeare or the Bible to interpret a work of literature, nor do you have to interpret a work of literature in terms of any specific influence, such as the Bible or Shakespeare. They can be very, very helpful tools, and that's the whole point. That's why Foster pays so much attention to things like Shakespeare and the Bible, because they are useful tools. But you don't need the Bible to understand Sonny's Blues. The Bible happens to be extremely helpful, partly because we know the Bible was very influential on the author, James Baldwin. All right. He had a very religious background, strong religious background, and he draws upon that in his writing. So it's useful if we know something about the Bible, right? But we could use other influences to understand this story. Later on in the text, for example, Foster talks about symbolism. Well, there's a lot of symbolism in this story. The symbolism of light and darkness, all right? The symbolism of cold and heat. The symbolism of fire and ice. All of these things are very important. We could say, okay, I'm going to try to understand this story. I'm going to try to answer the question about suffering, for example, in terms of Baldwin's use of symbolism. So it does not have to be the Bible. It does not have to be Shakespeare. But for our purposes, we're going to use the Bible, all right, because it happens to be a very handy way of understanding this story better. All right. Now, there are many things in the Bible that could apply to Sonny's Blues. The story of Cain and Abel, for example, two brothers, right? And that famous question that Cain asks the Lord after he has murdered his brother. And he says, am I my brother's keeper? And we know what the Lord says, of course. You are your brother's keeper. But that theme of keeping a brother in the sense of being responsible for, taking care of, is an extremely important theme in this story. The story focuses on the two brothers. It focuses a lot upon the trouble that the younger brother gets into. It focuses a lot on the fact that people knew that this brother, Sonny, was going to get into trouble, especially the mother, and so on. All right, so we have that whole question. The mother wants the brother, the older brother, whose name we don't know, wants that older brother to look after Sonny. And we also know that he has not looked after Sonny the way he should. All right? So we could say, okay, we're going to look at the story of Cain and Abel. And we're going to use that perhaps to understand this story more deeply. Now, please, don't think that in suggesting this, I'm trying to suggest that somehow the older brother does not take care of Sonny in the end, because in the end he comes around, right? He comes around to appreciating Sonny in a way he did not at first. He certainly does not murder Sonny the way Cain murders Abel, all right? Not in a literal sense, although you might want to ask in what figurative sense he might come close to murdering his brother. But that whole issue of responsibility for a brother is an important one in this story. But what we're going to do, and what I have asked you to do, is to look at the story in terms of the prodigal son. All right? So, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, beginning at verse 11, we hear the famous story about the so-called prodigal son. Now, I don't believe Luke, in writing this gospel and writing this particular chapter, ever uses the word prodigal. He tells the story of two sons. All right? A younger one and an older one. like Sonny and his older brother. The younger brother leaves home and he gets into trouble and he becomes destitute and he's practically starving to death. And so he goes home again, right? And we call him the prodigal son because he has been prodigal with his inheritance. He has asked his father to give him the money that the father would be willing him, okay, in his death. When the father were to pass on, then the son would inherit this money. The son says, I want it now, Dad, okay, because I want to go to the city and I want to party. All right. So, and he's been prodigal with this fortune, meaning he has wasted it. And he's wasted it, and now he is destitute, and he comes home. And when he comes home, the father rejoices that his son is still alive and that his son is with him again. But the older brother is resentful because the older brother has stayed home, right? The older brother has done the responsible thing, the respectable thing, right? He has stayed true to the family. He has stayed true to his father. And he wonders why then all of this attention being paid. Oh, excuse me. All of this attention being paid to the younger son. All right. Now, what we want to do is we want to see how we can use this story to better understand Sonny's blues. All right, let's get one thing very, very clear here, folks. When we apply something like a specific story from the Bible or from Shakespeare to another work of literature, such as Sonny's Blues, we are not saying that they are exactly alike. All right? And so we're not asking you, if I say, okay, please consider Sonny's Blues in terms of the prodigal son, I'm not saying, prove to me that they're exactly the same. There are, of course, major differences. And one major difference is that the story in the Gospel of Luke is a real bare bones story. There isn't a lot of detail. It's relatively short. And the story in Sonny's Blues is something like 20 pages long. And there is a lot of detail. We learn a lot about these two brothers and their lives. So there are going to be major differences. But what I want you to do is think about each of these stories, the prodigal son and Sonny's Blues, and look for similarities, look for parallels, and look for differences. Because the way in which Sonny's Blues departs from or is different from the prodigal son will also help you understand the story better, okay? So, just a few minutes then about how you might go about doing this. Think in terms of structure. We talked about the structure of the quest. In his first chapter, his chapter about the quest, Foster does just that. He talks about the quest story in terms of its overall structure. You can do the same thing with the prodigal son. Look at the basic structure of the parable itself. You have two brothers. You have a brother who takes a journey, right? Similarity to a quest there. All right. So, and this younger brother is doing what? He's going somewhere, right? He is leaving home. Where is he going? He's going to the city. What is he doing? He's looking for something, right? He's looking for something that apparently he didn't have at home. All right. And he's looking, perhaps he's just looking for a good time. Perhaps he's looking for some kind of happiness or reward that he wasn't getting working on his dad's farm, whatever it might be. But he has a reason for leaving home. And then once he has left home, he encounters certain trials and challenges and so on, doesn't he? And then he ends up going home again. All right. And what about that last element in the structure of the quest that Foster brings up? The real reason for the quest. And Foster says the real reason for the quest is always self-knowledge. Can you apply that to the prodigal son? And I think you can. So we can say, all right, we've got a basic structure here, and it looks as though the structure of this story is similar to the structure of the quest. Let's see how it might apply to Sonny's Blues. And so that's up to you, okay? But just a few tips. I mean, first of all, I want to say something about that whole fifth or final element in the structure of the quest. That is, the real reason for the quest is self-knowledge. Look at both brothers in terms of self-knowledge. All right? Can we apply that to the older brother as well as to Sonny? And perhaps who gains the greater self-knowledge? Can we apply the idea of a search? Can we apply the idea of a quest to both brothers? But don't forget the other elements in the story of the prodigal son. Think of Sonny, obviously, as the prodigal son himself. In what ways is Sonny similar to the prodigal son? Does he ask for some kind of inheritance? Does he ask for something and then does he go away and use that in some way? All right. And look at the older brother. In terms of the older brother in the prodigal son, what are the similarities and differences there? Is there some way in which we can say the older brother resents the younger brother? But finally, remember what I said about the differences. In Luke's story of the prodigal son, we don't actually see a reconciliation between the two brothers. The story ends with the father consoling the older brother by telling him, all that I have is yours, all of my love is yours. And we might infer from that that the older brother in the story might become reconciled to his younger brother. But look at the way in which the relationship between Sonny and his older brother develops. And especially look at what each of them learns from the other in that process of their coming together and becoming reconciled. So, now, those are some suggestions, not necessarily the only ways that you can apply the parable to the story. It's up to you. If you can think of other ways to make that comparison, then please do, feel free. And I look forward to seeing what you have to say on the subject. All right, that's all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in discussion.